Thank you, Anders, for the introduction, and it's really a great pleasure to be here, and it's really great to speak after Neil as well, and it's always a pleasure. So I'm gonna speak about, a lot of my talk is going to be about this collaboration between Moorfields and DeepMind, but the last part of my talk I'm going to just describe some of the other work that we're doing and some of the kind of spin-off work that we've started to explore. So just to tell you, I think it's important to note my disclosure, which is that I am paid as a consultant for DeepMind, so I do have a certain financial bias, but I do think that the kind of culture and the ethos of DeepMind is aligned with the culture and ethos of Moorfields. The other thing to tell you is that I'm a consultant ophthalmologist at Moorfields, but actually I'm also a clinical academic at UCL, at the Institute of Ophthalmology at UCL, and I'm funded by the National Institute for Health Research. And one of the nice things about the grant funding that I have is that 70% of my time is protected for research. So I'm in this very privileged position as a clinician that I only have to do clinics 1.5 days a week. And I think that's been a really big factor in allowing me and the people who work with me to be good clinical collaborators, because I know that that's not always the case. Now, I thought it might be, given that I was speaking after Neil, it might be good to just begin with a little bit of historical perspective. And just to tell you, you may not know this, but ophthalmology as a specialty is split into multiple subspecialties. And so actually I'm a retinal specialist, so I only specialize in the back of the eye. If you've got a problem at the front of your eye and you come to me, I send you away and send you to somebody else. And so my whole sort of, or my recent career, the last sort of 10 years or so, has been about how do we look through the keyhole, that is the pupil, to the back of the eye, the back wall of the eye, something we call the ocular fundus. So how do we look into this dark cave that is the ocular fundus? And so the historical perspective I thought I'd mention is that until about 1851, we had no way to look through that keyhole to look at the back of the eye in a living human subject. And it was Hermann von Helmholtz in 1851 who described the first ophthalmoscope. So the first time we could look at the retina, look at the optic nerve in a living human subject. Now, as an aside, and this is a little bit of trivia for you may not be aware of, that was von Helmholtz who got the credit for that. But the inventor probably should have been somebody that you guys will know quite a lot more about than I do, which is Charles Babbage. So it turns out, and this is something you can read about in the British Journal of Ophthalmology, that 4 years prior to von Helmholtz getting his prototype ophthalmoscope, Babbage came up with his own prototype ophthalmoscope. And so what do you think he did with it? Well, he got the idea, and then he decided to seek out the most senior, most eminent, most well-respected eye surgeon in London. And so he went to this guy, and he said, you know, I've got this thing, you know, do you want to give it a try? And so the guy, the eminent surgeon, got the prototype ophthalmoscope, tried it, and said to Babbage, this doesn't work. Even if it did work, I wouldn't need it. Why are you wasting my time? Leave me alone. And sheepishly then Babbage went away and put it aside, and von Helmholtz got the fame. Now what's interesting is that it turns out that this eminent surgeon that he went to see was very, very short-sighted. So he wasn't able to use the ophthalmoscope. And that kind of scuppered all the things. And the reason I love telling this story to an audience like this is because to me it says, choose your clinical collaborators well. Because, you know, some of us are good, some of us are not so good, and you know, that can have a big impact on the success of your projects. Okay, so that was the middle of the 19th century, and then towards the end of the 19th century you had the first efforts to actually capture the images of the back of the eye by Jackman and Webster. And so how do you think what sort of light source did they use to illuminate the dark cave? Well, of course, they had limited options, and so they used candles to try and illuminate the back of the eye. And you can think about the obvious kind of limitations of using that approach. And so as a result, oh, I missed it. Here is the first ever image of the ocular fundus, at least the first captured image. And so that is the optic nerve, and that is an artifact in the image. So actually it didn't catch on then at the sort of the turn of the 19th century, and it wasn't until the 1950s and the 1960s that you had 35 millimeter film, and you had these electronic flashes and all of these things that we were actually able to look at the back of the eye. And that triggered then a golden era in ophthalmology, where we actually learned for the first time what are the commonest causes of blindness, like macular degeneration, diabetic eye disease, and the like. And then the technology is getting better all the time, so it's gone from film to digital capture to cameras that can take pictures of the back of the eye without dilating the pupil. And even now you have something called PEEK, or Portable Eye Examination Kit, invented in the UK, some of you may have come across, where it's a little clip-on lens that you can put onto your smartphone. And what you can do is you can get somebody, and you do have to dilate their pupil, but I could give it to anyone in the room, and within a few seconds you can get on their fundus. So in other words, you can be looking, using your own camera, at their optic nerve and their retina, and so effectively looking at a part of their brain in a living human subject. So that's the way the technology has evolved with retinal photography. But the thing to tell you is that retinal photography is no longer the most important thing in ophthalmology, and hasn't been for the last sort of 15 years or so. So for ophthalmologists, that's like getting a chest x-ray in a world of CTs and MRIs. And so now, oh, that's the photo, but now the type of imaging that dominates ophthalmology is called OCT imaging, optical coherence tomography. And OCT is kind of like an ultrasound, but it measures the reflections of light waves instead of the echoes of sound. And it does that using interferometry. And it gives very, very high resolution images. So this is an OCT scan of my retina. And so this is a cross-section through the retina. In real life, the height of this is about 1/4 of a millimeter. It's like a layer of wet tissue paper that lines the back of your eye. Very, very delicate. And the resolution of that is about 5 micrometers. So an order of magnitude much better resolution than a CT scan or an MRI scan. And they're volumetric images.
And what are the different colors?
Those are pseudocolors. So those are just...
Would it correspond to density? Or?
It corresponds to the reflectivity of the light from different structures. So for example, the retinal pigment epithelium is full of melanin pigment, so it reflects back the light quite a lot. Now, OCT has come to dominate ophthalmology, but that has led to its own problems. And so one of the problems, this is Moorfields where I work, is that we're drowning in the number of OCT scans that we do. And we audit those numbers now, and in 2017, how many OCT scans do you think we did per day at Moorfields? Well, let me tell you, it's about 1,000 volume scans per day. So in fact, sometimes we go up to 1,200 or 1,300 of these OCT volumes per day at Moorfields. So it's a huge number, and that presents a big logistical challenge for us to be able to analyze those scans.
Is that one per patient? Or
so yeah, so that's 2 per patient. So the caveat is we always image both eyes, and so it's half the number of patients. The other caveat is that Moorfields has a number of sites around London. So there's Moorfields at St George's and Northwick Park, all part of the same trust. And of course, I'm giving you the largest number that combines everything. But the other problem that we face is this. So this is the high street. And at the moment, between 5 and 10% of high street opticians offer OCT scans as an optional extra when you go to get your glasses checked. And so you can you pay £30, £40, £50, whatever, have an OCT scan. Now, that is a good thing. But the problem is, it's a bit like, imagine if every GP in the country was given their own MRI scanner, and they were able to just do it, charge a little bit extra and do it quickly and easily on every patient that comes to them with a cough or a headache, but wasn't given the ability to interpret the scans. So it's led to a huge amount of false positive referral to the NHS. And you may not know this as well, but in 2017, ophthalmology overtook orthopedics on a national level as the busiest outpatient specialty in the UK. We see about 8 million patients per year in ophthalmology. Now, so in terms of false positive referrals, in 2016, in Moorfields, we got 7,000 urgent referrals as possible age-related macular degeneration, the commonest cause of blindness in the UK, in Europe, North America. And of those 7,000 urgent referrals, about 800 actually had wet AMD. Now, the problem then is that the Royal College of Ophthalmologists says if the referral says possible wet AMD, the serious form, then those patients need to be seen and treated within 2 weeks. But because of all these false positives, actually a lot of the patients don't get seen and treated in that time. And I wouldn't like to tell you what the real numbers in Moorfields and other hospitals around the country and around the world are. So it seemed to me that, and it's going to get worse, because in 2017, Specsavers announced that they were rolling out OCT across every single one of their branches around the UK and around the world. And Specsavers have 740 branches, and they do 9 million eye examinations in the UK per year. And Vision Express and Boots are going to follow suit with that. So there's a tsunami coming towards the NHS hospital eye services, and in a situation where we're already in trouble. Now, that's the context then for going back to sort of 2013 and 2014, when I was, hearing about deep learning and the breakthroughs. And of course, the context is I'm a clinician. I don't have any sort of specialist technical expertise at all, but just hearing about it and thinking, wouldn't this be a very good solution to being able to triage the patients and triage the referrals that we get? And so in 2016, we formally announced a collaboration between Moorfields and DeepMind to apply deep learning to these OCT scans to prioritize those patients with sight-threatening diseases and get them in front of somebody like me in as short a time as possible. Now, that was 2016, but the collaboration actually started in July of 2015, and it started when I contacted Mustafa Suleyman from DeepMind. And actually what happened was I had been thinking about deep learning for a while and just reading about it in the media and things like that, and trying to think about who should I get in touch with to help me with this. And let me tell you, I did try and find some academic collaborators, but really struggled to gain much interest. And so what happened was I read an article in Wired magazine in sort of June or July 2015, and there was a profile of DeepMind, and in it Mustafa Suleyman said something like, as a throwaway line, we're interested in applying deep learning to healthcare, climate change, energy, etc., etc. So what I did was I tracked down his LinkedIn profile, and I sort of paid for 1 month's free LinkedIn premium or something like that, just so that I could send him a message on LinkedIn without being connected to him. And I sent him a message saying something like, I'm a consultant at Moorfields. We do X thousand OCT scans per day or per week at Moorfields. People are losing their sight because they can't be seen quickly enough, and we're 2 stops away from you on the tube. We should apply deep learning to these scans. And so that led to this big collaboration. And I remember the first time I went to see Mustafa, and I went in full of enthusiasm, but then he very quickly started asking me questions like, well, you do X number of OCTs per week, but how many do you have in total? And I didn't really have a good answer for that. And what proportion of them have labels, and how good are the labels, and what's the file formats? Is it in proprietary or an open source file format? And most importantly, what are the ethical and the governance situation about getting access to this data? And so actually, I went away from that meeting and began a really arduous process which involved a lot of teamwork at Moorfields to begin to answer those questions. And that took me months. And let me tell you that if you ask most clinicians those questions, they'll tell you, okay, I'll get back to you in the next few weeks, and you never hear from them again because they cannot easily find the answers to those questions. Now, when we did answer all those questions, it got to the point then where in the middle of 2016 where we could actually put a data sharing agreement in place. And what we were able to do was share with DeepMind about 1.2 million anonymized historical OCT volume scans to train a deep learning algorithm. And so if we had achieved nothing else, let me tell you, nothing good scientific at all, that would have been an achievement, because that is a tricky thing to do, let me tell you. Now, of course, one of the things we recognize is that there's a lot of potential sensitivities and questions, and rightly so, questions about sharing of NHS data with an industry partner like Google, with sharing that data in general. And so we've tried, I think, to have a very kind of a very thoughtful approach to these kind of issues from the very start. And we've tried to take on board constructive criticism along the way about what is the best way to do this. And it's been a learning process for us. But one of the things that I like is that from the very start, when we announced the collaboration, there's a section of the Moorfields website, and you can still look on your phones or on your laptops, dedicated to this collaboration. And it has questions and answers. And it has questions such as, do patients have to give their consent for the data to be used? Well, the answer is no, if we're talking about anonymized data. So if the data lacks personal identifiable information, you don't have to give your consent. However, what we do on this page is that we have the links to the contact details of our information governance officer, so that if you want to opt out of the research, you can contact us and we won't send your OCT scans to DeepMind. Now, of course, once the scans are anonymized and sent to DeepMind, we can't actually re-identify them, so you can only opt out of future transfers. Now, to date, we've had about 9 members of the public, at least the last time I checked, who have contacted us to opt out of the research. And none of those people, as far as I know, have had OCT scans done at Moorfields. So somewhat of a moot point, but nonetheless, it's something that we try to take very, very seriously. And since, I believe, 2017, we've also incorporated national opt-outs for research as well. Now, before we did any sort of science at all in 2016, we published a protocol for our research in an open science journal. Now, in fairness, I think the protocol more or less just says we will apply machine learning to OCT scans. It's not anything particularly revelatory, but it's still something we wanted to try and do, to be as transparent as possible from as early as possible in the process. And then the other thing is that I'm really proud that our work has been patient-centered from the start. And we've had, from the very start, we've had a major support from all the big eye disease charities saying, look, this is a really important problem. And this is a patient of mine called Elaine Manna, who's got wet AMD. And Elaine has talked publicly about her condition many times. But Elaine is someone who lost her sight completely in her left eye about sort of 10 or 15 years ago from AMD. And this was before there was good treatments for the condition. And what happened to her was in 2013, she started to lose sight in her good eye. She went to her optician. She was told, it looks like it's happening to your good eye, but there's now some treatments available. We can give injections into your eyes and it can hold it back. You need to urgently see a retina specialist. So her optician arranges an urgent referral to the NHS, and Elaine gets an appointment 6 weeks later. Now, can you imagine sitting at home, losing the sight in your good eye and being told you have to wait 6 weeks? Because if that was my mother, I would probably want her to be seen in 6 days, not in 6 weeks, or perhaps even sooner. And so for me, the promise of of deep learning is maybe we can kind of facilitate something like that, and maybe this is a good task for something like that. So, you know, the first time I met Neil was just sort of talking about this collaboration a few years ago and sort of talking around the background to it. And one of the frustrating things for me was that I was being asked to give all these talks about the collaboration, but I wasn't able to show any results from the collaboration, as we hadn't published them yet. And someone told me, that's the best talk that I heard that didn't show any results whatsoever, which I took as a kind of mixed compliment. But so it was a great relief, actually, in sort of August and September of last year when we finally published the results of the first results of the collaboration. And what you can see is that there's 34 different co-authors in the paper, and I'm a senior author with a guy called Olaf Ronneberger, who of course many of you will know from DeepMind, but there's also lots of consultants at Moorfields, people from UCL and people from DeepMind. So I really think that this is a very, very big research collaboration, and emphatically it wasn't something where Moorfields just gave the data to DeepMind and DeepMind did their thing and then came back at the end of the process. So we really feel that we have a lot to add as clinical collaborators. Now, it was a great honor. It was very cool. It was featured on the cover of Nature Medicine, and then of course, this being AI, you can't escape the hype associated with it. And you can imagine how excited my parents were to see things like that, and the amount of like sharing on Facebook to the relatives of this sort of stuff, which was thrilling, but also a little bit awkward, because of course, it hasn't saved the sight of even a single person yet. And in fact, the algorithm has not been used in real life even a single time yet. It's because the Nature Medicine paper is our proof of concept of the algorithm on retrospective data. And it's still a couple of years from being away from something that we can actually use and deploy. And the reason that I've come to actually highlight that in my talks is because I give a talk like this and people email me afterwards and they say, can I come to Moorfields to see the AI in action? And I have to kind of disappoint them by saying, well, maybe in a couple of years. Now, what did we do? Well, we created this neural network framework where we got two neural networks. So we feed the raw OCT scan into a segmentation network, which we've trained with about 900 manually segmented OCT scans. That creates this kind of intermediate representation that is fed into a classification network, which interestingly, we only had to train with about 15,000 volumes. So not a huge number, actually. And then it makes a referral suggestion and it makes a diagnosis on the scans. Because remember, that was the original use case that I approached DeepMind for. So we designed everything with that in mind. And we used three-dimensional convolutional neural networks to do that. Now, a byproduct of creating this intermediate representation is that we get a ton of quantitative information about all the different disease features in the scans. And we think that that may give some interpretability to ophthalmologists that we think is quite useful. And the other thing to highlight is that we've trained it on more than 50 different retinal diseases. In fact, the only retinal diseases that we took out were cases at Moorfields where there was less than a certain number of cases in Moorfields. So if you're the only person with this rare disease in Moorfields, we didn't transfer your data because of the risks of re-identification with that. So we tried to take a very careful approach to these kind of issues of information governance. Now, what the algorithm does, so it basically, this is a sort of prototype of the viewer. You feed the raw volume, it creates this tissue map. For each of the disease features, it creates a heat map. So here's a patient with wet AMD. You can see this fibrovascular pigment epithelium detachment, subretinal fluid. It says choroidal neovascularization, 99.5% certainty, and recommends urgent referral. This is a patient with diabetes, a man in his 40s with very poorly controlled diabetes. And you can see there's the retina is very swollen and waterlogged. You can see that there's some flickering because we use ensemble machine learning. So there's 5 neural networks doing the segmentation. And then for each of those 5, there's 5 classification networks. And so you can see the way we would view it is sort of like in the majority of cases, it's like the diagnosis is straightforward, and all the experts that you ask are going to be consistent in the diagnosis. But what's interesting for us then is in ambiguous or challenging cases when we see some of the kind of disagreements between the networks. So how did we evaluate the performance? So what we did was we created an independent test set of about 1,000 new patients that presented to Moorfields who had these OCT scans done at the first presentation. And we got a reference standard diagnosis from what happened when they were presented, when they had the full range of diagnostic tests, not just OCT. They were treated, seen by a consultant, and followed up for a period of about 6 months. So in other words, if they were diagnosed with macular degeneration at the start, that 6 months later, nobody had changed their mind and said, we made a mistake. That was our reference standard diagnosis. Now, we then ran the algorithm on those 1,000 cases, and the main thing we were looking at was the errors on the referral decision. And it had about a 5.5% error rate on the referral decision, with lower, of course, being better. We then got 8 human experts at Moorfields. So 1 to 4 are consultant ophthalmologists at Moorfields who are retina specialists, some of whom have more than 20 years of experience and are world-famous retinal experts, the kind of people that you would go to for a second opinion or that I would send cases to for diagnostic dilemmas. And experts 5 to 8 are optometrists who work at Moorfields but have some more limited experience of looking at OCT scans. So how do you think they did? Well, the algorithm did better than all of the human experts except for the top 2, where it did a little bit better, but it wasn't statistically significantly different. And so this was kind of an amazing result. However, I would urge you to be very cautious whenever you see media headlines about superhuman performance or beating the best doctors at AI, because usually when you drill into the details, you find that the doctors are doing something that they don't do in their normal practice. Or they're doing what they normally do, but with one arm tied behind their back. So actually, this comparison is unfair because the doctors never look at the OCT in isolation. They would have a retinal photograph, they would have a visual acuity, they would have some sort of history, and that's what they would use to triage the patients. So to make it fairer, we repeated the exercise with the human experts, and we gave all that information. And that did make a lot of the human experts come down to be equivalent to the algorithm.
Quick question.
Sure, yeah.
So let's just focus on the two experts, 1 and 2.
Yeah.
The ones that they got wrong, do they overlap with the ones that the model got wrong?
They do actually. Yeah, that's the next slide. That's the next slide. But,
Ruined the punchline thing.
so, and you can see the best expert got down to 5.5% using all of the information. Interestingly, adding that other information didn't really help the model. Now, what did it get wrong? Well, I won't go into too much detail here, but the key point that the BBC said, AI did not miss a single urgent case. There's me examining a lane, or pretending to examine a lane. And so actually it turns out that the best human expert, that 5.5% error rate, a lot of those cases were ambiguous cases where actually we looked at it and we thought actually our reference standard is wrong, or at least debatable. But what was interesting, that was also the case for the deep learning system. So really interesting and kind of like weird for us as ophthalmologists to look at the way the algorithm assesses these cases and what it comes up with. So one of the things that we're interested in, and one of the reasons why Olaf Ronneberger wanted to construct things the way he did, was that we trained the algorithm on TopCon OCT scans, which is the workhorse in Moorfields, but there's a range of other OCT vendors, and the machines are quite different. And so another machine that we use at Moorfields very commonly is from Heidelberg Engineering. And so by setting things up the way we did, that was going to help us, I guess, be able to move the algorithm between different devices. So what I mean by that is when we take the original 2 networks and we've trained on TopCon, but we feed in a Heidelberg OCT volume, you find that the model, the segmentation network, just makes a mess. Doesn't know what it's looking at. And then it has a 50% error rate on the referral decision. But by setting it up in this way, what we could do was retrain the segmentation network with about 100 manually segmented cases, keep the same classification network, and then we get down to an error rate of about 3%. So it actually did better with that. And so, I mean, that may be sort of very self-evident to you guys, but to clinicians, it's not necessarily obvious that a system that you've developed for one device will not work on another system. And so if we can reduce the need for like accumulation of like another 100,000 scans before we can retrain the models, then maybe this is a good way to go. Now, where do I think that this could have a lot of impact? Well, I think that it could have a lot of impact in medical education, particularly this interpretability side of things. And I read this book by Gary Kasparov, some of you will have read, Deep Thinking, Where AI Ends and Human Creativity Begins. And the last chapter of that book is about kind of like the aftermath of Kasparov losing to Deep Blue and what happened. And so I think he makes some points about how young chess players now often train using chess computers. And the byproduct of that is that, you know, people become grandmasters at earlier ages than before. And people become grandmasters or good chess players in a much wider geographical distribution than before, and not typically centered on the Soviet Union, for example. And so I'll bet you, if you had tools like this, you could learn to become as good at me as interpreting OCT scans in a fraction of the time that it's taken me to learn to interpret the scans. Because the truth is that in medicine, you have a textbook and it's got a couple of pictures, small pictures of chest x-rays, and that's how you're supposed to learn. And the next thing you know, it's 3 o'clock in the morning and you're trying to interpret a chest x-ray from someone with dementia, you don't have the notes, and you don't know what you're doing, and it becomes much more challenging. And it's only through a long apprenticeship that you develop those skills. But these systems, I think, will accelerate that. So my last 3 or 4 slides are just about where we're going next, or 4 or 5 slides. And so one thing I'm interested in is this thing that I saw on TechCrunch a year or two ago called the AI, or they call the AI chasm, which is that there's a big gap between kind of doing a cool demo on a sort of toy data set and actually scalable deployment of an algorithm. And that is, really equally the case, if not more so, in healthcare also. And so one of the things that I'm excited about the work we've been doing with DeepMind is that we've essentially been rewriting the algorithm from the ground up so that it runs in a fraction of the time with a fraction of the computing power. And so it was exciting then in March of this year when we were able to do a live demo of this rewritten algorithm, and we were able to take an OCT scan of one of my patients on stage at Wired Health, click export on the software, send it up to the cloud, log in on a different laptop to a cloud-based PACS system, see the OCT scan, see the segmentation, and see the classification outputs. So that's a testament to the work that the guys at Google and DeepMind have done in rewriting this. But that's only a small component, because that's to say nothing of regulatory approvals, other clinical validation, and all of the other hurdles to actual real-world use. But if we can clear those, I think that it will lead to new pathways of care in the hospital, better use in the high street, and potentially there are people even developing home OCT scans at the moment. Now, the last couple of things I'll say is that one of the great things about this collaboration is that as a byproduct of the collaboration, Moorfields has now put in place the technical infrastructure to be able to aggregate and curate a lot of the data a lot of the imaging data that it generates. And in fact, our longer term goal is for all of our clinical data to be in a tractable form for AI. And we're working well towards that. And we've figured it out for OCT scans and for retinal photos. We're trying to expand it to other modalities. And we're also quite advanced in the process of transferring it to the cloud. And so in early 2018, NHS Digital had this very exciting announcement where they basically said that NHS providers may use cloud computing services for NHS data, subject to various information security approvals and caveats and the like. So that prompted us then to move our research database of anonymous data to the cloud, and we're in the process of doing that at the moment. And one of the things that has also allowed is a study that we call the ALTSI study. Now this is a study that we're doing that is in academia, that has nothing to do with Google or DeepMind. And that's a very strict part of the ethical approvals that we've gotten. But what we've done is, we've actually taken now 3 million plus OCT volume scans from more than 300,000 patients above the age of 40. And we've linked it to a central database at NHS Digital called the HES database, Hospital Episode Statistics database. And believe me, it's taken us about 18 months to get the approvals to do that. But the upshot is that of these patients who've had an OCT scan done at Moorfields, we now know which of those patients went on to develop each different type of dementia and a range of different cardiovascular diseases. And so we can begin to train deep learning models to predict these systemic diseases from these retinal exams. And everybody's excited about that in ophthalmology because of this example from Google Brain, where they were able to predict your age from a retinal photograph to within 3 years, and they were able to predict your gender or your biological sex from a photo with a stunning degree of accuracy. Now, why is that exciting? Well, let me tell you, I have looked at retinal images with obsessional devotion over the last 15 years, and I could not begin to tell you whether it's a man or a woman from the images. But deep learning can do it with stunning accuracy. So what does that say about the other relationships that we may be able to unlock? And of course, this is subject to lots of caveats and cautions around validation of this. But there's a sense that we may be able to get lots of these insights. Now, a question I get asked a lot then is, what's the future for ophthalmologists? And so some people might say, well, you know, we can be like safety drivers in autonomous cars, you know, and take over when things go wrong. Or we can provide the human communication skills, the empathy, the kind of give hugs to the patients, human interaction and all of those things. But one of my colleagues said when he heard that, I don't want to be a designated driver for a driverless car. And actually, I don't think that's the way it's going, at least not anytime soon. And so one of the things that I've been interested in the longer term is that in ophthalmology we have these very complex multimodal data sets, multiple psychophysical tests. We're moving towards an era where people will have assessments of their visual function taken from their own homes, from real life, from sensors, etc. Multiple imaging modalities, electrophysiology, multiple omics. And so I would imagine 5 years from now, 10 years from now, we'll have moved beyond kind of using deep learning for kind of image classification. And actually one of the things that I'm interested in, particularly why I wanted to come to Cambridge, was because just trying to read about, you know, works like that from Pietro at the back, graph neural networks, etc. And for me as a clinician, trying to get just enough of an understanding of the conceptual framework of what you guys are talking about when you describe these things, to be able to figure out how we can apply them meaningfully in healthcare. So my last slide, just to say, where are we going with this? Well, I'm as excited as the next person about the potential of deep learning for these tasks. I think it's quite likely it will work and quite well, but of course you'll know better than I that there's lots of ways that this might not work and lots of reasons to be cautious. So we must have the same level of kind of rigor in validating these things as if it was a new drug or new therapeutic intervention in these patients. I think there's huge, there's huge potential in the the ability to do kind of high-dimensional modeling of eye data to diagnose systemic disease. And I do think that ophthalmology is the medical specialty that's leading the way in applying artificial intelligence, deep learning, etc. And I do think it has the potential to reinvent the eye examination. Thank you very much.
I'm sure there are plenty of questions. I think you answered that, but I missed your answer. When the experts in the AI system fail in diagnosis, they all fail on the same examples, or is it different?
Yeah, it was, I think, it's a little bit embarrassing for me because we spent so much time in getting a good reference standard, and actually when we went back and find where it failed, it was probably some noise in our reference standards, or at least very kind of ambiguous labels on the reference standards.
But they all kind of failed then on
and they seem to, so we haven't really systematically evaluated that yet, but it seemed to have a lot of overlap.
Going back to the medical education piece, can you get from the model which areas of the retina are leading to the, say, prediction, if it's a, say, very urgent or whatever other classes you have?
Well, so I guess, I mean, you certainly see that it tells you that this is, you know, wet AMD, and then you see the output of the first segmentation network. You don't necessarily go between that intermediate representation, and so the classification network is still a kind of black box in that regard.
I mean, would that be useful though, if you could see which or as the medic, would you be able to spot?
So I think that one of the things that I noticed when I have these discussions with like machine learners is that there's a real risk when we talk about interpretability that we mean different things. And so what a computer scientist thinks is interpretable actually means something very different from what a human thinks is interpretable. And I think a lot of what computer scientists think of as interpretable is meaningless and not relevant to clinicians. So I think it still requires a lot more research and a lot more defining of what we mean.
I have two questions. One technical way, the OCT images are transferred by the high street.
No.
You do it, redo it.
No. So currently the setup is, although it's increasingly being used in the high street, there is no technical infrastructure existing for high street OCTs to come to the hospital at the moment. So when we published this, or when we talked about this first, Rory Keflin-Jones from the BBC posted on Twitter him having an OCT scan in the high street, and the only way he could send it in was taking a photo on his phone of the screen. And so he said, well, you know, AI is all well and good, but this is what I have to do to capture the OCT scan.
And what are the range of values of the, reflectances? What is the range of the value?
I think it's 255 for each point, and it's about 65 million voxels.
So when you're making a comparison with chess, you were suggesting that it provides a way to train clinicians. I mean, isn't it sort of more likely that clinicians are going to be spending fewer hours looking at these scans, and you're actually going to get a smaller number of experts like yourself?
I think.
I mean, as you see with aircraft pilots. I think nobody knows really how things are going to pan out with these things, and you know, I just came from Glasgow from the Royal College of Ophthalmologists annual conference earlier today, and we're having the same debates about how is it going to work, is it going to replace us, what can it do, where will it fail, etc. And so I tend to take an optimistic spin on these things as much as I can.
One last question. You very modestly told us that how little you know about AI.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for a talk that made it completely clear that was not true.
Well,
Do you think that AI-assisted diagnosis or medical intervention or whatever, is this a new thing for clinicians, or is it just another branch of science that is, you know, why would it, does a clinician, should they feel different about AI diagnosis than they do about other things that they may not happen to be experts on?
So I would say, before I answer that, let me thank you for the kind remarks about my knowledge. I guess if you place me against most other clinicians, I do know quite a bit more, but that said, against the backdrop of most other clinicians, think of AI as magic that can be sprinkled on things to suddenly like transform them. So in that context, I maybe know a little bit more. And so, what was the question again? It was...
question is, are AI-based diagnoses or whatever, are they just another sort of science, or do they have to be seen differently?
So I think that, you know, you could imagine that, like, you know, once you start to use these systems, that very quickly, within half an hour, it's just another tool that you use, and you sort of realize where it will work well, where it won't work well, all of those things. And I think that maybe the performance in certain domains is substantially better than before, but I think you know, we can go back to the 1990s to think of like decision support algorithms for breast cancer screening and things like that. So they've been around for a long time. It's just done in a slightly different way and potentially more powerfully.
May I suggest that we take more questions at the wine reception now, and then we thank so much for the wonderful talk.
Thank you.